that I want num to be equal to num plus 25. Well, this is actually going to give us 35, so it'll do exactly what we think it's going to do. But there's a shorthand for this. So I could actually just come over here and I could say num plus equals 25, and this is going to do exactly the same thing. So now we should get 35 all the same, which you can see we do. You could also use minus equals, divide equals, and multiplication equals. And basically, like, multiplication equals would just be the same as saying num times 25, right? It's basically doing the same thing, it's just a shorthand. All right, so all of that stuff can be pretty useful, and it can be pretty fun to just kind of play around with that. So another thing I want to show you guys is how we can use math operations. So there's a lot of like more complex math operations that we might want to do in our PHP programs. For example, instead of just doing like addition and subtraction, I might want to like find a square root of a number, or use exponents, or do something more advanced, some more advanced math calculation. And there's actually these things in PHP called functions. And functions are basically just like little snippets of code that we can call, which will perform a specific operation for us. And we're going to talk more about functions later in the course. But for now, just know that a function can basically like do something for us in our program. And there's a lot of math functions that we can use in PHP, which will perform math operations for us. So for example, let's say I wanted to find the absolute value of a number. Absolute value is just like, if the number is negative or positive, it's always just going to give you like the value. So I could just say ABS. I can make an open and close parentheses. And inside of these parentheses, I could put a number. So I could put like negative 100. And this is actually going to give me back the absolute value of 100. So if I was to print this out over here, you can see we just get 100 instead of negative 100. You can also do a bunch of other math operations. So for example, let's say we wanted to take a number to a power, like I wanted to do like 2 raised to the 4th power or something like that. We could say POW, and in here I could just pass in a 2 and a 4. And now this is going to give us 2 raised to the 4th power. So over here we get 16. We could also do like kind of the opposite. So I could, instead of taking a number to a power, I could say square root, so SQRT. And then in here I could pass a number, like if I passed 144, now we're going to get 12 back. And you can see over here we do. So that can be, that's an easy way to get a square root of a number. Another thing we could do is compare numbers. So I could actually come over here and I could say max. And when I say max, I can pass 2 numbers into this parenthesis. So I could say like 2, I'll separate it with a comma, and then I could say 10. And basically what this function is going to do is it's going to tell us which of these 2 numbers is bigger. So what it should do is it should just print out 10 because that's the bigger number. And you'll see over here we get 10. There's another one I can use which is called min. So I could say, instead of max, we could say min. And now this will do the opposite. So it'll tell me which number is smaller. So over here you can see now instead of 10 we're getting 2 because 2 was the smaller of the numbers. So in addition to doing something like that, we could also round our numbers. So let's say I have like a decimal number and I want to round it up or down. I could just say round, and in here I could just pass a number. So I could say like 3.2, and this will round it down to 3. So it's going to round according to just like standard rounding rules. If I had like 3.7, now this will round it up to 4. There's also 2 other functions. So one's called ceil. And this is called the ceiling function. And basically, no matter what decimal point is over here, it's always going to round it up. So no matter what, it's always just going to round this number up. So you'll see here we get 4, even though this is a 3.3. And I could do the same thing in the other direction. So I could say floor. And now no matter what, this will round it down. So even if I had like a 3.9 over here, it's always going to round this number down. So we're always going to get 3. So that's just kind of like a couple of these different math functions that you can use. And to be honest with you, there are dozens and dozens of these math functions that are available in PHP. I mean, there's all sorts of things to do things with like logarithms, and you can do stuff with like sine, cosine, tangent, all that stuff. I'm not going to spend time going through every single one. If you'd like to find more of these math functions, you can basically just go online and search PHP math functions. There's a bunch of pages with, full explanations on how to use all of these guys. But I really just wanted to give you guys an introduction into kind of like all these different operations that you can use and sort of like how you can go about using them. So hopefully you guys learned something. You know, obviously working with numbers is extremely important, and numbers is probably the most common type of data that we're going to be working with in our programs. So you want to make sure that you have a sort of solid understanding of how numbers work and how you can work with them. In this tutorial, I want to show you guys how to get input from users in PHP. So a lot of times in our PHP programs, you know, we're going to be dealing with all sorts of information and data, but a lot of times we're going to want to be able to get that information and that data from a user, right? Any good website is going to allow the user to be interacting with it, you know, filling out forms, doing all sorts of stuff on the website. So in PHP, we can actually get input from users that type information into things like text boxes or buttons or, you know, really anything like that. So I'm going to show you guys how we can do that in PHP. Now, in order to do this in PHP, we're actually going to need to do a couple things. The first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to set up something called a form. Now, if you're familiar with HTML, then hopefully you have like a basic understanding of what a form is. But if not, I'm going to go ahead and explain it to you guys. A form is basically a special HTML element that's going to allow the user to input information, and then it'll be able to pass the information that the user enters over to our PHP programs. So the form is kind of like the middleman between HTML and PHP, right? So the form is where HTML and PHP meet, and it's essentially just a way that PHP can get information from a user. So we can set up a form, and then inside of that form, we can put like text boxes or radio buttons or, you know, submit buttons, really anything that we want, and then the user is going to be able to interact with us, and PHP will be able to get what the user enters. So this is going to be kind of cool. And down here, I'm going to show you guys how we can set up a basic HTML form. So I'm just going to come over here and we're just going to type out form. And we need to give this some HTML attributes. So the first thing that I want to put in here is just the keyword action. And I'm just going to say action is equal to and open and close quotation marks. And inside here, we're basically going to put the name of the PHP page that we want to be able to handle this form. So in our case, I'm over here on my site.php file, and this is just the file that we've been using throughout this course. And this is the file where I want to handle what happens with the form. So down here, I'm just going to put the name of this page. So it's just site.php. So we're basically just put the name of the PHP page that we want to work with. And then over here, we're going to make another one, which is going to be called method. And this is essentially going to tell this form what we're trying to do with it. With this form, we're trying to get information from the user. Like, the whole purpose of having this form here is that we want to be able to get information from the user and use it in our PHP code. So I'm just going to put get right here, and get is basically just going to mean that we're trying to get information. So now I have the first part of this form, and we want to come down here and we're just going to make a closing tag. So I'm just going to close this form off. Now, inside of this form, I can actually put some like text boxes. Basically, I can put HTML elements that will allow the user to interact with the page. So, you know, something where they can type in or like a button that they can press. So over here, I'm going to make an input. So I'm just going to say input. And input is actually a special tag that can be used with these forms. And the input tag will allow the user to input information. And since it's like special, it'll work with the form in order to pass that information back to PHP. So over here, I can just say input, and I want to give this a type. And I'm just going to say input type is equal to text. And this is just going to give us a basic text box. And then over here, I want to give this one more thing. We're going to give this a name. And you want to make sure that this is a, it's going to be a name that's going to describe what type of content you're getting. And also this name needs to be unique. So let's say for the purposes of this tutorial and for the purposes of this program, why don't we ask the user to enter in their name? So I'll basically just prompt the user, tell them that they should enter in their name. So I'm actually just going to call this name. And then finally, we can just end off this input tag. And then over here, I'm just going to type in a prompt. So I'm basically just going to type in name. And this will kind of like tell us what this text box is for. So now if I was to come over here and refresh my page, you guys will see that we have this text box and it's basically asking us for our name. So I could actually type into here and it'll allow me to input information. But we're not done. There's one more thing that we have to do, and we have to put a submit button. So, once the user types in the information that they want, I want them to be able to click a button, and then that information will basically get submitted. So what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to create a button. So I'm just going to say input, and type is going to be equal to submit. So this submit button is special. It's basically just going to submit all the information in the text boxes up here. So when I click this submit button, it's basically going to submit the information to PHP, and we'll be able to, access all the information that got submitted in our PHP program. So over here, like I said, just type submit, and then you'll see that we're getting this submit button down here. So now we have our HTML form set up. So we actually have everything set up on the HTML side. Now we need to go over into PHP, and I'll show you guys how we can actually get access to all of the information that was entered in this form. So over here I have my little PHP tags, and I'm actually just going to take these and I'm going to move them down here below the form. So I'm going to make like a break tag, and I'm going to put the PHP down here. And so what we can actually do now is inside of these PHP tags, we can access the information that got submitted when we click that submit button. So when I go over and I click that submit button, essentially what happens is that form gets submitted, and we can access the information that got submitted inside of our PHP program. So what I can actually do is I can just say echo. And remember, the echo command is just going to sort of echo something out into the HTML document. And what I want to do is I want to echo out the name that the user input, right? So remember, we gave this a name. It was just called name. And down here, I want to echo out that information that got submitted. So what I can actually do is I can say echo, and I'm going to make a $_ and I'm going to type out GET, and this stands for get. So this is basically going to get the information that got submitted. And then I'm going to make an open and closed square bracket, and inside of here I'm going to make quotation marks, and I'm going to type out the name of the input that I want to grab. So you'll notice over here, this input tag for the name, I gave it a name called name, right? So this was its name. Down here I can just type that in. And basically what this is going to do now is it's going to print out the value that got submitted inside of that text box. So if I was to come over here to my program, and I can come over here and just type in my name. So I'm just going to type in Mike. Now when I click submit, what's going to happen is the name that I submitted is going to get echoed out onto the page. So let's click submit, and you'll see over here it echoes out that value. So it echoes out Mike. And it was actually pretty easy, right? All we had to do was set up this form, and then down here we said get, and we passed in the name of the input tag. So I could make this whatever I wanted. I could change this to like username if I wanted, and then down here I could change this to username, and it's going to do the same thing. So that name is pretty arbitrary. Like it can be whatever you want it to be. It just has to match. So the name over here has to match the name up there. And so that's basically how we can get input from the user. We set up our form, we allow the user to enter in that text box, and then when they click that submit button, essentially what happens is this field over here is going to get populated with the user's name, and we'll be able to print it out. So that's basically how this works. And if I wanted, I could actually come over here and I could print out like your name is, and then it'll print out their name. So now it'll be like a little bit more of a explanation. So you'll see down here now it says like your name is ADSF. But if I actually typed in my name like Mike, now it'll say your name is Mike. So essentially we're taking the information that we got from the form and we're sort of like interweaving it into our HTML document just like that. And you can really do this for as much information as you want. So obviously over here we're just getting their name, but if I wanted, I could get another piece of information. So I could say like, let's ask them to enter in their age. And actually over here, we're gonna put a break tag. So I could say like enter your age, and then again, we can just make another input, and we can make this a number input because it's an age, and I could call this age, and then we can sort of like close this off. And then down here, I could print out their name. So I'm actually just gonna copy this line up here, and we can paste this down here, and I'm also gonna put a break tag here. And now instead of saying your name is, I could say like your age is, and then over here we can just print out their age. So now I can actually enter in two pieces of information, the name and the age. So over here, we could say like someone's name is John and they're 30, and now it'll populate both of these fields with that information. So you can see we're getting John and 30. So that's sort of the basics of getting input from users, and really this is just scratching the surface. Obviously you can get more complex with the types of information that you're getting and the amount of information that you're getting, but this basic concept is going to apply in every aspect of PHP, right? We set up our form, we use this action, which is just going to point to the current page, and then we're using this get method. And then down here, when we want to access that information that gets submitted, we can just say like $_get, and then the name of the input form that was submitted. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to build a basic calculator in PHP. So we're basically going to design a little program where the user can enter in two numbers, and then our program will add those two numbers together and print out the result. So it's going to be a pretty simple calculator, but this should show you guys how we can get numbers from the user in PHP. So down here I have a basic little program set up, and essentially in my HTML I just have a form, and the action is set to site.php, and that's the name of the file that I'm currently on. And then over here we have the method as get. And in the last tutorial I kind of explained what all of this was doing. And then finally down here we have this submit button, which is basically going to submit the form so that we can access whatever the user entered in our PHP, which I've placed down here. So the first thing we need to do if we want to build this calculator is we're going to need to get information from the user. So essentially we're going to need to get two numbers from the user, right? We're going to need to get those two numbers, and then we can add them together and print out the result. So what we should do is we should actually create two inputs. So we're basically going to create like two little input boxes where the user can enter in those numbers, and then we can grab that information. So I'm going to create two of these little inputs. I'm just going to say input, and I'm going to say type is equal to, and in HTML there's actually a special type we can use for numbers. So you can just say number, and so type equal to number is basically going to make it so the user can only enter in a number, so they're not going to be able to enter in text. And then over here we can just give this a name. So I'm going to say name is equal to, and we'll just call this num1. So this is going to be the first number that they're going to enter. Then we can just make like a break tag, and then I'm going to do this same exact thing. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to go ahead and paste this down here. And again, the input type is going to be a number, but I'm going to call this one num2. So now we have input boxes for the first number and for the second number, and we have our submit button. So basically what's going to happen is when I click that submit button, this information, the information inside of both of these boxes, is going to get submitted, and we'll be able to access it from within our PHP. So down here in the PHP, what I want to actually do is I want to get access to those pieces of information, to num1 and num2. And essentially all I want to do is add them together. So what I could do is I could actually just say echo, and I'm basically just going to echo out the result of adding those two numbers together. So what we want to do is we want to get the first number, and I can just say $_get in all caps, and then I'm going to make an open and close square bracket, and inside of here I'm just going to say num1. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to get whatever the user typed into that first number box, and it's going to put it over here. And then what I want to do is I want to add num2 onto it. So I'm going to put a plus sign here, and I'm going to essentially do the same exact thing. I'm going to say $_get, open and close square brackets, and we're going to say num2. Essentially what we're saying here is I want to echo out into the HTML num1 plus num2. And because both of these were entered in as numbers, in other words, because I said the type of input was going to be a number, PHP will actually add these numbers together as if they were actual numbers. So if I put like 2 and 3 in there, we should get 5. So this will go ahead and print out the answer. And then I'm just going to come over here and I'll say answer, and then we'll be printing out the answer. So let's go over to our HTML, or to my browser. I'll refresh the page, and you'll see over here we have our two text boxes. We have our submit button, and then over here it says the answer is 0, and that's basically just because we haven't entered in any numbers yet. So if I came over here and I said like 10, and then down here we said, I don't know, 21, now this will give us the result of adding those. So I'm going to click submit, and down here it says 31. So that is essentially how we can go about adding two numbers together. Now I want to show you guys one cool thing. So if I was to make this browser window a little bit bigger, you'll notice up here inside of the URL, we have these little line over here. It says num1 is equal to 10, ampersand num2 is equal to 21. And essentially what this is doing is it's telling us what the values of those variables were. So with PHP, this can actually get added onto the URL. So if I was to change this up here in the URL, like if I changed num2 to like 50 and then I clicked enter, this is actually going to change the information that gets entered in. So without having to type numbers inside of here, like without having to do anything, I was actually able to change what the answer was down here. And this is sort of a key concept in PHP, and I wanted to introduce it in this tutorial. Anytime that we're entering in information with that form, when the form gets submitted, the information that got submitted is going to appear up here in the URL. And so essentially what's happening is when I load up this page, I can give these different pieces of information. So I say like num1 is equal to 100. And now, since I said num1 is equal to 100 up here in the URL, it's going to take the value of num1 as 100. So when I click enter now, num1 becomes 100 and it adds those two numbers together. So like I said, whenever we submit that form, that information shows up here. So if I was to get rid of this and I just hit enter, you'll notice that this whole form gets reset. But now if I put in like 40 and I put in 30 and click submit, it's essentially just adding these things onto the end of the URL, and this information is basically telling us what this answer is going to be. So that's sort of like how that works up there in the URL. And that's not like, you know, too important. Later in the course, we can actually leverage those URLs to do different things. But like I said, I'm going to talk more about that later. But I just wanted to kind of mention it so you guys aren't confused if you see that stuff up there in the URL. So this program works pretty well, and we're able to, you know, add different numbers together. And this kind of shows you, instead of getting text, how we can get numbers, and we can actually do math on those numbers in our PHP program. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to build a Mad Libs game in PHP. Now, if you're not familiar with Mad Libs, it's basically a game where you can enter in like a bunch of random words, and then you'll take all those random words and kind of like sprinkle them in through a story. And usually because you entered in a bunch of random stuff, the story ends up being like pretty funny. I actually have a picture over here in my browser. See, this is kind of just like a basic Mad Lib. Essentially, you're entering in different like parts of speech or different things like nouns or like a person or a place. And then all those things that you enter in will get, like I said, sprinkled in throughout a story. So we're going to build something like this, just like a Mad Lib. Essentially, we're going to allow the user to enter in a bunch of different words, and then we'll take those words and put them into our story. Down here, I have a little basic story set up. And it's basically just saying roses are red, violets are blue, I love you. So this is kind of like a classic poem, but I think it would be a lot better if we Mad Libbed it up and we allowed the user to enter in some, you know, random stuff. So how about instead of saying roses are red, we let the user enter in a custom color. So this will just be like a color. Instead of saying violets are blue, why don't we let them enter in their own plural noun? So, and then finally, instead of saying I love you, why don't we let them say I love and then some celebrity. So I love celebrity. So now, instead of saying roses are red, violets are blue, I love you, it's going to say roses are, and then the color that they enter, the plural noun that they enter are blue, and then I love the celebrity that they enter. So this should be kind of cool. And you can see just over here in my program, I'm printing it out. And in order to do this, we're actually going to have to get information from the user. So we're going to have to let the user enter in some words that they want to use in the story. So up here I have this form already set up, and it's just actions site.php. This is the name of the PHP file that we're currently on, and it says method get, and then down here I have a submit button. So this is a very basic form outline. And inside of this form, we want to basically prompt the user to enter in some information. So we're going to have them enter in a color, a plural noun, and a celebrity. So I'm just going to say color, and then over here we'll make an input tag, and type is going to be equal to text, and we're going to give this a name. So why don't we just call this color? And then I'm just going to say, I'm going to make a break over here. And I'm basically just going to copy this, and we'll use this same thing for the plural noun and for the celebrity. So over here, we'll make this plural noun. And we're just going to call this plural noun. And then finally over here, we'll do the same thing for the celebrity. And again, we'll just call this celebrity instead of color. So essentially I have 3 input boxes, 3 text boxes. One's asking for a color, the other is asking for a plural noun, and the other one is asking for a celebrity. And you can see I gave them all names to match. So this one's name is color, plural noun, and celebrity. So we have our form set up, right? In other words, we have the prompts set up for the user to enter in that information. The last thing that we need to do now is we need to be able to get that information when they submit the form and put it into our story. So let's go down here to our story, and I'm going to show you guys how we can do that. So what I want to do is I want to create 3 variables, and each one of these variables is actually going to store the color, the plural noun, and the celebrity. And inside of these variables, we're going to store the result of getting that information from the user. So I'm just going to say color, and I'm going to set this equal to $_get, open and close square brackets, and then the name of that text box. So it was just color. And basically what's going to happen is when the user submits the form, this variable is going to get populated with whatever they entered in for the color. And we can do the same thing for the plural noun. So I'm just going to call this plural noun, and this is going to be equal to get, and here it's going to be plural noun. And then finally, we're going to do the same thing for the celebrity. So we're going to say celebrity is equal to get, and we want to get the celebrity. Then, now that we have these variables, we can just print them out inside of our story. So down here, instead of saying color, I can just say the color variable. So this will print out the value that's stored inside of the color variable. Same thing is going to be for the plural noun. And then down here, we'll just say plural noun. And then finally, we'll do the same for the celebrity. So essentially, I stored all of the things that the user input inside of these variables. And then down here, I'm actually going to print them out inside of the story. All right, so let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to go over to my web page. So you can see over here, we have all of this information set up now. And you'll see down here, this story is basically just printing out roses are blank, blank are blue, I love blank. And then over here, we can actually start submitting some information. So over here in color, I'm just gonna type in magenta, plural noun. Why don't we do like microwaves? And then celebrity, let's do Tom Hanks. So now when I click submit, all of this information should get submitted, and it's gonna get stored inside of each one of these variables. Then those variables are gonna get printed out inside of our story. So let's do that. I'm gonna click submit, and you'll see down here that our story updates. So it says, roses are magenta, microwaves are blue, I love Tom Hanks. So we were actually able to make this Mad Libs now. Now, obviously, the one problem with this Mad Libs is that, if I was to like reset this form, this is like showing up here before we actually submitted the form. So ideally, we would want this text to show up after we submit the form, like after the user's entered in all the stuff and not before. And actually later in the course, we're gonna learn a technique that we can use to do something like that. But for now, this kind of works. And you can see how, we could essentially enter in whatever color, whatever plural noun, and whatever celebrity we wanted, and it would show up inside of our story just like that. So hopefully that makes sense. And what you should do is just build your own Mad Libs game, and you can model your own little Mad Lib story and sort of play around with it. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about URL parameters in PHP. Now, a URL parameter is basically just a value that we can tack on to the end of one of our URLs, which will essentially pass a value into our PHP program, and then we can access it. So I want to show you guys basically how this works and what it's doing. So over here, I have a very simple program set up. I have this form over here. The action is site.php. That's the page that I'm currently working on. And then the method is get. And whenever we're using these URL parameters, you always want to make sure that this says get right there. And actually in the next video, I'm going to talk to you guys some more about what get actually is doing. And there's actually another method we can use called post. So if you're interested in like exactly what's going on here, check out the next tutorial. But for now, I just want to talk to you guys about these URL parameters. So make sure that get is put over here. And then I basically am just asking the user to enter in their name. So I'm using this text box over here, telling them to enter in their name, and then we have a submit button. And then down here in my PHP, I'm basically just printing out the name onto the browser. So if I come over here, I can use this program. I could just like type in my name, Mike, and when I click submit, my name prints out down there on the page. Very simple. But one thing I want to show you guys is when I expand my browser window over here, you'll notice that up here it says site.php ? Name is equal to Mike. So essentially what happened was when I submitted that form, the value for name actually got placed inside of our URL. And this is what we would call a URL parameter or a URL variable or a URL value. And basically what this means is this is just the piece of information that we're giving to PHP. So I could come over here and I could change this to like Dave. And now you'll see that the value updates down here. So without having to type in anything, like if I typed in a name up here, Steve, and I click submit, you'll notice that it updates down here and it also updates up here. But if I wanted, I could just bypass this text box altogether and I could pass a value in here like John, and now that's going to be the value that this page is getting. So up until this point in the course, we've always been getting our information through these text boxes. And that's a very common way to do it. A lot of times you're going to want your user to interact with the website using things like text boxes or buttons. But other times in our PHP programs, you might want to give information to your PHP page without having to like make the user do it. So in other words, in certain circumstances, like there might just be certain values that I want to give in a specific URL, and I don't necessarily want the user to have to enter them. And we can use these URL parameters in order to do that. So if I want to add another URL parameter over here, you'll notice that we say essentially the name of the site. Then we use this question mark, and that sort of delineates these two things. And then over here, I'm basically saying the name of the parameter or the name of the variable, and then the value that we're giving to it. If I want to add another one, I can just say ampersand, and now I can do the same thing. So let's say we wanted to pass in like an age. I could say like age is equal to 70. So now in addition to giving this page this name value, I'm also giving it this age value over here with a value of 70. So if I was to come over here and I just like entered this in, you'll notice that like nothing's changing, right? Even though I added that new, parameter up here in the URL, it doesn't really change anything on the page. But inside of our PHP, it's going to change a lot. So I could actually access this value that got passed in the URL. So I could come down here and instead of echoing the name, I could actually echo the age now. So because we passed in this variable age, I'm able to print out what it was. So instead of printing out the name now, when I enter this, it's going to print out the age. So you can see we're printing out 70. And if I was to get rid of this up here in the URL, now it's just not going to print out anything because it didn't receive that value. And this is a really awesome way for us to build these URLs. One of the reasons that this is so useful is because you could have a web page that's has a bunch of values associated with it, and then you could store all of those values in the URL. So a user could actually like bookmark that page and they could go back to that page with all of that same information set for the page. And this doesn't have to be like someone's name or someone's age. I mean, this could be any information that you want to store on a particular web page. And like I said, because all of it's stored in the URL, users can like bookmark that page and they can have all of that information stored. So a lot of websites will do something like this. For example, if I came over here and I like did a Google search, so if I just searched for like dogs, for example, when I hit enter, you'll notice that Google has something similar. So, I don't know exactly what technology Google's using, but you'll see over here, Google has something similar to what we did over there. So they have like this ampersand, they have this little value here, AQS is equal to Chrome, ... whatever. So Google is doing similar things. Inside of the Google URL, there's also information stored just like we had on our URL. So this can be kind of useful. And obviously, like, Google's using this for some complex use case. Obviously, we're just passing in a name, but the concept is the same. We can store information inside of these URLs. Now, here's one of the problems with something like this is that it's not very secure. So all of the information that we pass into this website is basically visible. So if I was to type in like my name over here and I click submit, the name that got passed in is that, it's basically visible and available up here in the URL. In a lot of circumstances, you're going to want it to be visible, like I said, for bookmarking or something else. But in other circumstances, you're not going to want the user to be able to, see this information or even be able to modify it. Like I could just modify this piece of information and it's going to change, what happens on my website. For a situation like that, we can actually use another form method. So you'll notice up here inside of my form, I have this little method attribute that says get. There's another method called post, which we can use, which will basically do the same thing, but in a more secure fashion. And in the next tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about what that post method can do. And we'll just talk about the differences between get and post. But for now, that's kind of been an explanation of those URL parameters. And those are extremely useful, like I said, for any information that you just kind of want to be publicly available. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about two different ways that we can get information from users. And basically, these are two form methods called get and post. And I'm just going to talk about the difference between the two of them, and we'll kind of look at what they're doing and when you should use get and when you should use post. So let's go ahead and get started. Down here, I have a basic program set up. Basically, I have this form, and all it's doing is asking the user for a password. So here I have this input, and it's a type password, and the name is called password, right? And whenever we put type password over here, this is actually going to give us a text box, which is a password. So you'll see over here in this text box, when I type in, it sort of blocks it out. And that's basically just you can see that a lot on different websites, just so nobody can see what you're typing in when you're typing in your password. And then obviously we have this submit button, and then down here in the PHP, I'm just echoing out the password. So that way we can just see what I enter in. So if I came over here, I could enter in a password, and then when I click submit, the password will show up down here. So my password was WordPass. And I want to talk to you guys now about the different ways that we could get something like a password from the user. So over here and up to this point in this course, whenever we've been building these forms, we've always set this method equal to get. And basically, when we set this method equal to get, what's going to happen is the information that the user enters is obviously it's going to get submitted into PHP, and we're going to be able to use it. But that information is also going to get put up in the URL as a URL parameter. And a URL parameter is basically just a way that we can pass information into PHP. So when I use this get method, you'll see over here when I entered in my password, the password actually showed up here inside of the URL. So if I was to enter in another password, I'll enter another password, click submit, I entered in banana, and now because I used that get method over here, the password is actually showing up inside of the URL. Now, I'm sure you can imagine, this is not a good scenario for a password. Certain information that we're passing into our PHP pages is going to be fine to show up there in the URL, right? It's not going to be a problem. It doesn't really matter with certain pieces of information. But with a password, if your password is actually showing up inside the URL, that is extremely insecure. And also, I could come up here and I could change it. So I could change the password to orange. And now the password is updated throughout the entire page, right? So a piece of information like a password is not something that should be stored up there inside the URL. And it's not something that the user should just be able to change willy-nilly whenever they want in the URL. In a situation like that where we have information that we want to, pass between the client and the server more securely, we want to use the post method. So down here, instead of saying get, I'm actually just going to say post. And just with that one change, this is actually going to update. So down here, if we're using post, if I want to actually be able to print this out, instead of saying get, I'm just going to say post all in caps. So basically this over here is going to match this down here. And post is basically just going to do exactly what get did, except it's going to do it without placing it up in the URL parameter. And there's also like a couple other small differences. Like when you use post, you can actually get potentially more information from the user than when you use get. But the main difference is that when we use post, it's going to be more secure. So that information isn't going to show up inside of the URL. So over here, if I was just to like refresh my page, you'll see when I refresh my page, even though I have password equals to orange up here in the URL, it's not showing up down here anymore, right? So that information, like when I put the information up here, it wasn't able to show up. But if I was to enter in a password into this text field, because it's using this post method, so if I entered in my password and I click submit, now we're going to be able to grab that information securely. And you'll notice up here in the URL, there's no information, right? That information did not show up in the URL. It got passed between the client and the server in a more secure fashion. That's basically the difference between get and post. Get is just kind of like anything goes. Anyone can see the information. It's up there in the URL. And in a lot of cases, that's going to be useful. But in a lot of other cases, like in the case of a password or even like a username or, a credit card number, I mean, any type of like secure information, you don't want it to show up inside that URL. You want it to be passed more securely back to PHP, and we can use post in order to do that. So like I said, in certain circumstances, get's going to be appropriate. In certain circumstances, post is going to be appropriate. But now that you kind of know the difference, you can kind of make that decision for yourself. And this is just a quick note about PHP in general. Most of the time, developers are going to prefer to use post as opposed to get whenever they're getting information from a form just like this. So a lot of times you'll see people using post more so than using get. Get is going to be used more with like URL parameters, but here's the thing. It's really up to you. It's up to you, the developer, to make the decision as far as like what you want to be able to happen when that form gets submitted. But like I said, I think for the most part, people prefer to use post over get when they're getting information from a form. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about arrays in PHP. Now, an array is basically a container, or it's a structure where we can store multiple pieces of information. So a lot of times in PHP, we're going to be dealing with all types of data. And one way that we can manage and maintain and keep track of that data is by using something called a variable. And throughout this course, we've been using variables. I've kind of, showed you guys how they work. And a variable is great because it can store one single value. So it's a container where I can store a single data value. But a lot of times in PHP, we're not just going to want to be able to store one value. We're going to want to be able to store large groups of values. So a lot of times an array is all that we need, right? A lot of times we only need to be able to store one value. But if you have like a large list of information, or you need a container where you can store large amounts of information, that's where an array comes in. An array is actually very similar to a variable, but unlike a variable, an array can store more than one piece of information inside of it. So an array could have 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000 or even 1,000,000 values, 1,000,000 pieces of information inside of it. So that's why arrays are really useful. And there's a lot of situations where you're going to want to be able to store and keep track of large amounts of information, and you can use arrays to do that. So I'm going to show you guys how we can create an array, how we can use it, and we'll sort of look at the basics. So down here in my PHP tags, I want to create an array. And we actually create an array very similar to the way that we create a normal variable. I'm just going to make a $, and we're going to give this a name. So we want to give it a descriptive name, and the name will basically tell us like what type of information is stored inside of this array. So I'm going to make an array that's going to store a bunch of like names. So we'll just call it friends. So maybe this could store like a list of a bunch of my friends. So I can say $friends is equal to, and now I want to type in array, and I'm going to make an open and close parentheses, and then as always, we'll end it off with a semicolon. Now, inside of these open and close parentheses, I can actually store multiple pieces of information inside of this array. So in our case, we're going to store, like I said, a list of friends' names. So I could put like Kevin, Karen, Oscar, and then why don't we do one more, Jim. So inside of this array, I've basically typed out all of these different values. And you'll notice that I separated each one of these values with a comma. So over here, I basically am just listing out all these different names. And these are all now elements inside of the friends array. So I would say that this over here is an element inside the friends array. This is an element in the friends array. This is an element. These are all elements inside of this one structure, inside of this one container. So unlike a variable where I can only store one string, in this array, I can store multiple strings side by side just like that. And that's why these arrays are useful. So in addition to just storing a string inside of here, I mean, I could store any type of data that I want. So maybe in here, I also wanted to throw in like a number. I could throw in like a Boolean value. Really, you can put any type of information that you want inside of these arrays. It's not gonna matter. So now that we've actually created this array and we're storing all of this information, the question becomes, how do we access that information, right? The information's no good if we can't access it, right? So this container is actually storing all these pieces of information, and I'm gonna show you guys how we can access them. So over here, I'm actually just going to echo out something. So I'm just gonna say echo, and I'm gonna show you guys how we can access individual elements inside of this array. Now, one thing I could do is I could just echo out friends, just like this. And you'll see over here on my browser, when I refresh the page, it's just printing out array. So it's basically just telling us like, hey, this is an array. There's a bunch of stuff in here. But if I wanted to access an individual element, for example, let's say I wanted to access the first element inside of the array, this Kevin value. After I type out the name of the variable, I can make an open and closed square bracket. And inside of this open and closed square bracket, I want to put in the index of the element that I want to access. So all of the elements inside of this array are assigned index positions. And so all I have to do in order to access the specific element is put its index inside of these square brackets. So if I want to access this first element here, I'm going to put a 0 inside of here because the first element in the array is at index position 0. So now when I run my program over here, you'll see that we're printing out Kevin. So we're printing out that first name inside of the array. If I wanted to print out the second element, I could just put a 1 here, and this will print out the second one, so we should print out Karen. And if I wanted to print out Oscar over here, I could put a 2 in here, and this will print out Oscar. So if you haven't caught on, when we're giving index positions to these array elements, we start at 0. So we would say that the first element in the array, this Kevin, is actually at index position 0. And then over here, we would say that the second element in the array, Karen, is at index position 1, and so forth. So we're going to start 0, 1, this is going to be 2, this is going to be 3. And this is very important. So this is how we're going to index these arrays. And if you're familiar with strings in PHP, this is actually the same way that we index strings. So we start with 0. So that's why I have to use these numbers down here. And that's really how we can access and work with a specific element in the array. Another thing I could do is I could modify one of the elements in the array. So for example, over here, let's say we wanted to modify this element right here where it says Karen. All I have to do is just say friends, and I can make an open and close square bracket, and I want to put the index of the element that I want to modify. So Karen is at index position 0, 1. So I'm going to put a 1 over here, and I could just give this a new value. So I could call this Dwight, for example. And now when I go down here and I print out friends 1, the value will have updated. So now this should give us Dwight instead of giving us Karen. And it's also important to note that we can store different data types in these arrays alongside each other. So I could put like a 400 here, and this is a number, it's not a string, and you'll see that this is still gonna work. So I'm able to print out 400. All right, so this is really the basics of using arrays in PHP. It's essentially just a structure where we can store multiple pieces of information. Now, another thing that I could do is I could also add information onto this array. So you'll notice over here we have 4 elements in this array, and it's at index position 0, 1, 2, 3. So there's no array element at index position 4. But I could actually add an array element in if I wanted to. So I could come over here and I could say like friends 4, and I could add in another friend. So now I could name this friend like Angela. And down here I could print out friends 4, and this is going to give us Angela. So essentially what I did was I added an extra friend onto the end of that list. And you can do stuff like that. I mean, I could also make this like a 10 and it would be the same thing. So I could add an element at index position 10 in this array and it's going to be no problem. It's going to be able to handle that just fine. Now I want to show you guys one more thing we can do, which is actually pretty useful with these arrays, is you can figure out how many elements are inside of the array. So I'm actually just going to get rid of this and I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to print out count like this, and then I'm going to surround the array with open and close parentheses. So I'm saying count and then inside of these parentheses friends, and this is going to tell me how many elements are inside of this array. So you'll see over here we're getting 4. And if I wanted, like I said, I could add another element. So I could say like friends 4 is equal to Mike. And now we should get 5 here instead of 4 because I added another element. And that's kind of the basics of working with arrays. Arrays are extremely useful, and there's going to be tons of situations where you want to use them. So you want to make sure that you have a pretty solid understanding of these going forward. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how we can get input from checkboxes in PHP. This is going to be a pretty cool tutorial because not only are we going to learn how to get input from text boxes, but we're also going to see how we can use arrays out in the real world. So this is going to be an example where we're actually get information from the user. We'll store that information inside of an array, and then we can kind of work with it. So this is going to be pretty cool. Now, over here in my program, I have just sort of a basic program set up already. Down here, I have a form, and you can see the action is site.php. That's this file that I'm currently working on. And then over here, the method is post. And then down here, we have our submit button. So this is a pretty standard form. And then down here in our PHP, I haven't actually written anything yet. So what I want to do is I want to show you guys how we can work with checkboxes. And a checkbox is basically just, like a little box where you can check. And what we'll actually do is we'll have like a list of checkboxes. So we'll have like 4 or 5. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow the user to select their favorite fruits. So I'm going to have like a little list of a bunch of fruits, and the user will be able to check which fruits they like, and they'll be able to submit that information to us. So it's gonna be pretty cool. And it'll just kind of demonstrate how we can use checkboxes and how we can also use arrays. So over here, right on top of this submit, I'm gonna make another input. I'm just gonna say input, the type is gonna be equal to checkbox. So this is basically gonna tell HTML that we wanna create a checkbox. And then over here, I want to give this a name. So I'm gonna say name is equal to, I'm just gonna call this fruits, and I'm gonna make an open and closed square bracket. Now, whenever we're trying to get input from like multiple checkboxes, we always wanna put these square brackets here. And basically that's gonna signify that we're gonna store all of these fruits inside of an array. And once they're in the array, it'll be a lot easier for us to work with them and do different things with them. And finally, I want to put one more attribute down here, which is going to be value. And value is essentially going to be the value that this checkbox is going to have associated to it. So we're going to have this checkbox be a checkbox for apples. So that's going to be our first fruit. So if the user checks this checkbox, that means that they like apples because that's the value over here. And then I'm just gonna put a break over here. And actually I'm gonna do one more thing. So I'm gonna come over here to the left of this input and I'm just gonna type out what it is for. So I'll just say apples. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm basically gonna do this for a bunch of different fruits. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy this line of code, and I'm basically just gonna paste it down here a few times. So why don't we do like 3 different fruits? So we'll do apples, let's do oranges. So I'm just gonna change this to oranges over here. And then over here on the value, I'm also gonna change this to oranges. And then down here, why don't we do pears? So this one's gonna be pears. And then once again, over here, I'm gonna change this to pears. So we have a checkbox for 3 different fruits. And making the checkbox is pretty simple. Again, we just have to specify the type, we have to give it a name. And remember, if we want all of these checkboxes to sort of be stored inside of the same array, in other words, if we want the values that the user checks to be stored in the same container, in the same array, we have to name it just like this. And then finally, we give each of these a value. So if I was to refresh my page, you'll see over here that we get all these different checkboxes. And what's cool about checkboxes is I could check multiple boxes. So, I can basically just check and uncheck as many as I want. Here's the question though. What I want to do is I want to be able to get the values that the user checks. So if the user checks apples and oranges, when they click submit, I want to be able to get that information, right? If they select all three, I want to be able to get that information. And because the user is able to select multiple pieces of information here, we're storing it inside of an array. And remember, an array is just a container that can hold multiple pieces of information. And that's basically what I was saying down here in this name. I'm saying I want to store all of these values. In other words, I want to store the values that the user checks inside of this fruits array. So inside of our PHP now, we can actually get that information. So what I can do is I can come down here and I'm going to create a variable called fruits, and I'm going to set this equal to $_ post in all capitals. And remember, I use post up here, so I want to use post down here. And I'm going to make an open and close square bracket, and inside of here, we're just going to type out fruits. So I'm basically typing out the name that I specified up here, although we're going to leave off the square brackets. We don't need that. So down here, I now am storing all the fruits that the user checked and submitted inside of this variable. And actually, this is an array. So this is an array that's holding all of the fruits that the user checked from the checkbox. So I could come down here, and why don't we just like echo this out just so we can kind of see what's going on. So I'll echo out fruits 0. So this is basically going to tell us what the first fruit that was checked is. So over here, back on our web browser, I'm just going to refresh the page. And now I'm going to go ahead and do this. So I'm going to check apples and oranges. So I'm checking 2 of these different boxes. When I click submit, we should be printing out apples because that was the first checkbox that I checked. So now when I click submit, you see we're getting apples down here. If I was to come over here and print out fruits 1, so this is going to be the second fruit in the list. Now, if I do the same thing, so if I do apples and oranges, we should be printing out oranges because that was the second element that was stored inside of that array. If I only checked one of these though, since I'm trying to print out the second element in the array, it should be blank. So now you can see it's blank. And if I did like oranges and pears, now we'll be printing out pears. So that's basically how these checkboxes work, right? I can set up all these different checkboxes, and because I gave them all the same name over here, they're all going to be stored inside of the same array. So when I click that submit button, all that information is getting passed back to PHP on the server, and it's basically storing that information inside of an array, and then I can work with that information and do different things with it. So this is a pretty useful thing to do on your websites, and as you can see, it's very simple, right? And we can use that array structure in order to store all of that information. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to use associative arrays in PHP. An associative array is a special type of array where not only we can store data values, but we can actually store what are called key value pairs. So unlike a normal array where I could just store like numbers or text or a combination of both, in an associative array, I could store a series of key value pairs which would allow me to access that information differently. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys how these work. The easiest way to wrap your mind around it is just to see an example. So let's create an example, and then we're actually gonna create a little web application where we can use these associative arrays. So down here, I'm gonna show you guys how we can use these. Let's say that I was writing a website for a school. And for this website, I wanted to be able to keep track of the different students in my class and the grades that they got on a particular test. Well, this is actually a scenario where we could use something called an associative array. So in other words, inside of this array, I'm going to be storing 2 pieces of information. I'm going to be storing the student's name, and I'm going to be storing the grade that they got on the test. And those 2 data values are sort of like linked together. And in an associative array, we could actually represent data like that. So I'm going to create this just like I'd create a normal array. I'm going to make a $, and why don't we just call this like grades, and I'm going to set this equal to array with an open and close parentheses. So far this is exactly like a normal array. The difference is though, now when I put elements inside of this array, instead of just storing single pieces of information, I'm going to store key value pairs. So the first thing I want to do is store the student's name. So let's say the student's name is Jim, and then I want to say equal sign, greater than sign, and I'm going to store the grade that Jim got on the test. So let's say that Jim got an A+ on the test. Let's say Jim's really smart. So unlike a normal element in an array, I'm storing a key, which is the student's name, and then I'm storing a value. In other words, I'm mapping a value to a specific student's name. Over here, I can do the same thing for another student. So let's say we have another student, Pam, and let's say that Pam got a B- on the test. All right, so now I'm storing the student, and I'm also storing the grade that they got on the test. Why don't we do one more? Let's make another student, and you'll notice I'm separating these different students with this comma, just like I would normal array elements. So over here, we're just gonna say Oscar, and let's say that Oscar got a